Hi, folks. Today, I'm just continuing a series of messages entitled Foundations of Our Faith. And last week we talked about God and who God is, what God's about. And today we're just going to consider the question or the idea about God becoming human, God becoming flesh and living amongst us. And the truth is, Jesus has truly occupied a lot of places in our culture's history, in our minds, in the way we think about him. He's in everything. He's in our literature, he's in our poetry, he's in our art. He's even in our popular music. In fact, you don't have to listen very long on most radio stations to hear some mention of Jesus. I grew up listening to the Doobie Brothers, and one of my favorite songs, even long before I became a Christian, was Jesus is All Right With Me, or Just All Right With Me. Then just a host of things. As I was just thinking about the stuff that I was aware of, Dispatch Mode sang a song called Personal Jesus, and then it was picked up by people like Johnny Cash, and then even Marilyn Manson did a version of it. Elton John sang a song called Tiny Dancer. And part of the lyrics go like this: Jesus freaks out in the street, handing out tickets for God. I always thought that was kind of a funny line. And then James Taylor sang a song, you probably remember it if you're like me at all, called Fire and Rain. And one of the lines in that says, "Won't you look down on me, Jesus? And you've got to help me make it through. You've got to help me make a stand." Again, Jesus just occupies a lot of time in our culture's collective consciousness. And so today I want to just take a look at this. People have been thinking about God and thinking about God on earth for a long time, as long as people have been thinking. Truthfully, the idea of God taking material form occupies most faith systems. Sometimes God is seen as an animal, maybe like a dragon or a serpent or a white elephant, depending on your faith system. Other times, God is seen as some sort of a celestial body, like the sun or the moon or the stars or a meteor or something of that nature. Other times, God has taken the shape in people's minds of a half human, half being, like an elephant or oh gosh, like Nimbus or Osiris or Dagon, gods that are part man, part bird, or part bull, or all kinds of odd things. Or maybe in their thinking, like the Romans or the Greeks or the Hindus, God appears very human in appearance, just more powerful. But the truth is that the God of the Bible is the one I really want to focus on. And in the Bible, we see Jesus, who is God, taking on humanity. He's putting on skin. He's living among us, and that really has changed the world. Not just a small corner of it, not just someplace in Palestine, but has literally changed the whole world. And the question that I want us to really consider today is, why would anybody care who Jesus is? Why? And I think, in truth, if we look at history, if we look at Jesus' life, people have honestly been asking that question: who is Jesus? Since Jesus came on the scene. When the wise men came seeking him, Herod was wondering, who is this Jesus who is born King of the Jews? And the disciples and others asked the questions like, well, who is this man? Who is this guy that even the demons obey him? Or the wind obeys him? Or this guy that can heal the sick? This guy that speaks with such authority, has such a close relationship with God? I wonder if maybe the Roman officer who officiated Jesus' crucifixion didn't kind of have a handle on it. I don't know exactly what he was thinking, but in Matthew 27, we see him ultimately coming to the conclusion that this was no ordinary man, that he thought, whatever his understanding, he thought that this truly was the Son of God. And since people have been asking this question as long as Jesus has been around or has been known of, I think it's important for us to be able to answer that in our own heart, in our own mind. Who is Jesus? Who do we think he is? And I think the fact that he exists, that he has changed lives, that he has the power to do so, the fact that he is God, begs us to try and come to grips with who we really think Jesus is. And so while I'm interested in what other people have said and what other people have thought about Jesus, I'm truly more concerned about what you think about Jesus. Because how we answer that question, how we answer the question, who is Jesus, determines a lot. It determines how we're going to live our lives. It determines how we're going to spend our forever. It determines even how we're going to relate to our Creator. And so today, what I really want to do is I want to focus on just a couple of basic questions. Again, as I said last week, there's no way I'm going to cover adequately any of these one topics in the brief time that we get to spend. And so I just want to focus on this question. Who is Jesus? And what difference does that really make for you and me? Years ago, some 600 years before Jesus ever walked the earth, there was a guy named Isaiah, and he wrote this about Jesus. He said, "Who has believed our message, and to whom will the Lord reveal his saving power? My servant grew up in the Lord's presence like a tender green shoot, sprouting from a root in dry and sterile ground. There wasn't anything beautiful or majestic about his appearance, nothing to attract us to him. He was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with bitterest grief. We turned our backs on him and looked the other way when he went by. He was despised, and we didn't care." That was Isaiah describing the coming Messiah. He was describing what Jesus was going to be like. And I think that as we think about that, there are some who really believe that Jesus is a myth, a fairy tale. He didn't really exist. And again, I'm not going to go into a ton of details, but it's just important that we understand that the existence of Jesus, the Jesus of the Bible, is truly one of the most provable facts in all of history. I truly don't know of any credible scholars that can say Jesus didn't exist, the Jesus that we read about in the Bible. Even atheists, even people that are avowed atheists, have to concede that the person Jesus truly did exist. Now, then where you go from that is another question, but the existence of the man Jesus truly is unquestionable. And just a couple of things, just a couple. There's so many. But back in 2002, CNN found something, or they reported on something that had been found in the Holy Land. It's called an ossuary, which is kind of like a coffin, only it's technically a bone box. And there's hundreds, thousands of them all over Israel. And the thing that made this one unique is the inscription on it that said, "This is James, the son of Joseph, the brother of Jesus." And you can go literally look this up in CNN.com, and it was reported on 10/21/02. So you can go see this for yourself. The thing that made this such a unique case was that there are lots of these boxes, but very, very, very rarely, like on the order of just a handful, that ever had the person's name, the father's name, and a brother's name. And so the implication is that whoever this person was, the brother, was somebody of note, somebody of incredible importance. And so this box said James, who was Jesus' brother, and Joseph, who was Jesus' father, his earthly dad, and then Jesus himself. And the fact that all three of those names appear, common names in Israel at the time, but the fact that all three of them together, and a Jesus that was so important that his name would actually be inscribed on an ossuary, is highly unlikely, unless this Jesus was somebody of incredible note, and the only Jesus that history knows about that was so important that his name would end up on something like that was the Jesus of the Bible. Another fellow, he was a Jewish historian hired by the Romans to write a history of the Jews. His name was Flavius Josephus, and he wrote this history shortly after Jesus' death, but he actually writes an account of Jesus. And again, there's lots of people that have done this, but Flavius Josephus is maybe one of the more common, the more well-known of the group. And this is what he said. He said, now, there was about that time, he's talking about Pilate, about that time there was Jesus, a wise man, if it's lawful to call him a man, because he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many Jews and many Gentiles. That's non-Jews. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at first didn't forsake him, because he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold. These and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. Josephus, again, he wasn't a Christian. He was hired by the Romans to write a history about the Jews, and you wouldn't think that somebody who was writing something for the Romans who didn't support Christianity, in fact outlawed it, would have written something that wasn't true. Truthfully, I mean, you just look at every major faith system, and even what they think about Jesus. Islam looks at Jesus as one of their greatest prophets. In fact, did things that Muhammad couldn't do. He performed miracles and had his own revelations, which Muhammad only got stuff from Allah. The Hindus look at Jesus as a great teacher who was moving toward enlightenment. Even the Jews, by and large, think of Jesus as a rabbi, but think his followers got things backwards and sideways and thought he was the Messiah when he really wasn't. But if you just look at all of the major faith systems that exist today, virtually every one of them has something good to say about Jesus. They believe that Jesus was a good guy, a good teacher, a prophet. And so the existence of Jesus as a human really is uncontested. As I said before, even atheists, if they're honest, they have to concede the fact that there was a man named Jesus who lived in Jerusalem and Nazareth and Bethlehem around this time, and that there really is very little, no supporting evidence to be sure that he didn't exist. The Bible tells us over and over and over again that Jesus did exist and that he was who he said he was. In the book of Romans, Paul writes these words. He says that the law of Moses couldn't save us because of our sinful nature, but God put into effect a different plan to save us. He sent his own Son in a human body like ours, except that ours were sinful. God destroyed sin's control over us by giving his Son as a sacrifice for our sins. Again, the Bible points to the fact that Jesus was, every major faith system does, historical evidence abounds that Jesus truly existed. Again, we could talk about that all day long, but the reality is I just want you to know that there is no good reason to think that a person named Jesus did not exist. But what I want us to really look at is who was Jesus, God become flesh? And I think it's important for us to realize that he really came a long way just to be here. He existed as God, the God we talked about last week, the Creator God. He existed as the one who is every place, who knows everything, who is all powerful. He existed in that form. He's God. And he chose to put on flesh and ultimately to limit himself and to come to the earth and live among us. And we'll talk about why in just a second, but understand how far he came just to be with us. He left the throne room of heaven in all of its splendor and all of its glory. He left heaven to come and live among us. Paul tried to capture that, just the distance in the book of Philippians when he wrote this. He said, though he was God, talking about Jesus, though he was God, he didn't demand and cling to his rights as God. He made himself nothing. He took the humble position of a slave and appeared in human form. And in human form, he obediently humbled himself even further by dying a criminal's death on the cross. Again, he was in heaven, existing as God. He could do anything, have anything, be anything, and he chose to put on flesh, and he chose to come and live among us. And he didn't choose to come and live in a palace. He didn't come and choose to live as the most powerful being on the planet. He chose to come in the form of a tiny, helpless baby in a group of people who were ultimately slaves, and gave his life for us. I think he did this for relationship's sake. He wanted us to understand that not only are we designed to connect, but that he desires to connect with us. He did this so I think he could understand us, so that we could know that he understands what it's like to be us, what it's like to experience frustration and temptation and anger and just fear. He understood those things because he lived like one of us. And ultimately, as Paul writes, he came so that he could offer us a way out. He came so that he could offer us hope. Even though we failed, even though we've blown it, he came to pay a debt for us that required him surrendering his life. I can't honestly wrap my head around the distance that he chose to travel for me and for you. But the reality is that Jesus left heaven and came here and lived among us. There's a scene that John writes in the book of Revelation, the 12th chapter, and it truly is incredible. It helps me get a handle on this journey that Jesus was being able to make and the perilous nature of it. In the 12th chapter, we see this scene about a woman who's about to give birth, and while she's in the process of giving birth, there's this dragon that's just waiting to devour the woman and waiting to devour this child. And as I understand it, it's just talking about this incredible moment when Jesus came into humanity and became one of us. And in the midst of that, there was this conflict that the enemy of God was trying to destroy him. And when I think about that, I'm going, how much does God really love me? And how much does he really love you, that knowing full well the adversity that he would face, knowing full well the adversary that he would face, knowing full well what it was going to cost him, he chose to leave the comfort of heaven to come here and to live among us and ultimately to lay down his life for us. And so I don't know what that means to you, but when I think about Jesus, we refer to him in so many different ways, but Jesus, the Son of God, God become flesh, God among us, all of that means some incredible things to me. I think it demonstrates to me, anyhow, the humility of God. God become man. God putting on the limitations of a man. It demonstrates to me that God cares more about us than himself. It demonstrates the approachability of God. He didn't stay aloof in heaven and isolated and cut off, but he came here to live among us. It speaks to his courageousness. I mean, my word, he was willing to do battle for us, face incredible foes for us, overcome insurmountable odds for us. And I believe that it shows that God loves everybody. Again, he could have been born anywhere, in any palace, in any time, and chose Israel when they were slaves. And not just when they were slaves, but when they were militarily occupied by a group of people that didn't care about them. And he chose to be born in that situation so that we could all discover freedom. Because Jesus was a human being, he knows what it's like. He can identify with us. He knows what it's like to grow up. He knows what it's like to have brothers and sisters and a mom and a dad. He knows what it's like to feel that frustration. He learned what it was like to be obedient, even when maybe he didn't want to be. Could you imagine being Jesus growing up? Could you imagine when Mary was talking to James about his brother Jesus and saying, well, why can't you be more like your brother? I mean, could you imagine that? Do you think you walk on water, James or Jesus? Do you think you can heal the sick? Do you think you're God? Well, yeah. Could you just imagine what it was like growing up, Jesus? To be God? And to have flawed parents, and to have flawed brothers and sisters, to have flawed friends. To want more for them. He truly understood what it was like to be obedient to human authority. He understood poverty. He understood disappointment. He understood what it was like to be lonely and to be angry, to be betrayed. He understood friendship. He understood pain. He understood love. He understood what it was like to lose somebody that was dear to him. We don't read a lot about Joseph after the birth. So a lot of people think that maybe Joseph shortly after Jesus' birth either died or sort of faded out of the picture. But by the time Jesus reaches adulthood, most people think that Joseph had died. So Jesus understood that. He understood the loss of a friend when his friend Lazarus died. Jesus was grief-stricken about that. He understands that pain. And maybe you need to hear this. He understood what it was like to be tempted, to want to do the wrong thing, to want to do something that you know isn't what God desires. He understands that. He understands the pressure. And not just that he understands it intellectually, but he experienced it. Jesus understands us. And I believe that draws us into a relationship with somebody, a God who can relate to us. I don't know if all of this makes sense to you, but I'm hoping that what this means to you is that you get, if nothing else, that Jesus gets you. He understands you. He understands your circumstance. He understands your life. He understands the things that cause you great stress. He understands the things that make you want to walk away. He understands the things that make you just stare up at heaven and say, why? He understands all of those things. The writer of Hebrews tried to capture that idea this way when he says this, that is why we have a great high priest who has gone to heaven, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us cling to him and never stop trusting him. This high priest of ours understands our weakness because he faced all of the same temptations that we do, yet he didn't sin. Let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God, and there we will receive his mercy, and we will find grace to help us when we need it, because he's been there. He understands. He's our friend. The Bible says he's our brother. He is the bridge between us and our Creator God. He's our counselor. He's our advocate. He's our example. He is the one that we must follow, because he came and lived among us as one of us, and he did it right. And so whenever there's a question, whenever there's a moment we don't know exactly what we ought to be doing or how we ought to be doing it, we can look to Jesus and say, well, that's how he did it. That's how I want to do it. I'm really hoping, again, I know there's a lot of things I didn't talk about, a lot of stuff I didn't cover in all of this, but what I really hope that you will wrestle with me is that if God put on flesh and lived among us and died for us, that means something. I hope it means something to you. I hope that it has changed your life, is changing your life. And ultimately, I hope that you will choose to follow Jesus. And if you need some help in figuring out how to do that, would you call me? Would you talk to me? You can email me at ckccdale@gmail.com. I'd love to talk to you more. You can pick up the phone and call me at the church office. And let's chat. You can reach out in any way that you want to. I would love to talk to you and introduce you to this person that we know as Jesus. Let me just pray. Lord God, I am grateful for you. I'm grateful that you chose to become like us, to live among us, to understand us, to relate to us, and ultimately to pave the way for us to be in a right relationship with you. I'm overwhelmed that you would be willing to do that. And I would pray today that as we grow closer to you, as we come to know you, as we choose to follow you, that our lives would become a reflection of who you are to the world around us. Lord, I pray all of these things in your most amazing name. Amen. Have a great day, folks.